We live in a world where a broken past or a traumatizing past can create justification for evil. I'll explain that. How many of you guys like literature? The very few of you, and literature wasn't really my strong suit. But literature is based upon characters. Without characters, there is no story. There's not going to be a substantial story without characters. There has to be characters. There's usually a good guy and a bad guy. And to be honest with you, the best stories that have ever been written was when there was a clear line between the two. When there was a very clear good side and a very clear bad side. I was talking about that with James the other day. The best stories, the ones that are the most successful, are the ones where there's a clear distinction between good and evil. I was watching a show the other day where there was an antagonist, and this is how everything's being written today. The villain, the antagonist, had a really terrible past, terrible things happened, and it brought to the point where it wasn't really the villain's choice. It wasn't really the antagonist's choice to be the villain. It wasn't his fault that he's the bad guy because all these things led up to that point. We live in a world where we justify sin by the bad things that happen, to the point that not only people are looking for bad things to happen in their life. People are looking to be put into a group, to be put into a minority, so that way they can justify an action. The way the world is laid out today is to be broken away from Christ. It's when you're broken, it's to get further and further away from truth. And this is happening even in churches. There's a justification for poor actions, for not spreading the gospel, for a lack of love because of our circumstances, because of our brokenness. Brokenness is laid out through the entire Bible. It's a concept that I've battled with for years now. But how do we be broken to Christ? How do we guarantee that brokenness takes us to Christ and not away from Him? In a world that is looking for brokenness, that is looking for bad things, and when the bad things happen, it makes people worse, how do we become better? In the Bible, what shows us that? I want to look at a very specific character and his life. There's only a handful of chapters, but we have his entire life. I want to look at Joseph and the pattern that his life lays out. How many of you guys know Joseph was broken? Joseph went through some things. Let's have a quick word of prayer. Dear God, I'm thankful to be here. I pray that you'll work through me, that your truth will not return void, that it will change lives as it has changed mine and affected mine. I pray that you'll give me the words to speak. I pray that you'll keep us safe. I pray for the sickness, that you'll heal people. I pray that people will see you, that we will be focused on the cross. In Jesus' name, amen. In Genesis 37, we are introduced to Joseph. In verse number 2, it says, "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, and his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report." We are introduced to Joseph in chapter number 37. I want to look at the beginning of Joseph's life. That's where I want to start. And we'll kind of go through it chronologically. I'm not going to go through it, read everything, but I want to take bits and pieces and kind of put them together. If you do have the time, you can do a study on everything, all of Joseph's life. But I want to see, the first thing we see is a desire for justice in Joseph's life. There's a desire for balance and truth. The first thing we see Joseph doing is feeding the flock. And the second thing we see Joseph doing is bringing unto his father, his brother's evil report. The first thing we see in Joseph's life is a desire for justice, a desire for truth. There's a moral balance happening in Joseph's life. Joseph has a moral clock like we all do. He knows good and evil. And his desire is that it's taken care of. Then we see the privilege in Joseph's life. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Joseph was privileged. Joseph was in a good position. He was loved by his father more than any of his brothers. And he was given a coat of many colors, something outward to show his father's love to him, something physical. And of course, we know about Joseph that he had a dream. Joseph was a dreamer. Joseph is interesting because he's one of the few characters in the Bible that not only interpreted dreams later that were from God, but he had dreams of his own that were from God. When people brought their dreams to Joseph, he knew what it was like because he had had dreams from God before. God had talked to Joseph through the dreams. That's how God had chosen to talk to him. Joseph had a dream. His dream was a promise. A promise. We'll talk more about that. So we see that Joseph has a moral balance in his life. He has a desire for justice. In the beginning of his life, he's privileged. He's in a good position. And he has a dream that God had given him, a promise. But we know that Joseph's life takes a turn for brokenness. The beginning of Joseph's life turns into the breaking of Joseph's life. We see first he loses his privilege. In Genesis 37 and verse 23, it says, "And it came to pass when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him." They took away the physical representation of his father's love to him. But taking away that outward, the coat, did not change what was on the inside. And we'll see that throughout Joseph's life. Joseph's heart stayed the same. The coat represented something, but what was happening on the inside stayed. They couldn't take that from him. No matter where he was in life, they couldn't strip that away from him. He lost his privilege. The setting changed. He was put in a new place. In verse 36, it says, "And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard." This was probably shocking. I couldn't describe it. I don't understand what Joseph was going through, what was happening in Joseph's mind, but everything changes for Joseph. Everything. Everything outward stays the same. He's put in a new place. He gains respect. It says, "And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight. And he served him, and he made him an overseer in his house, and all that he had put into his hand." This was a respect, but it was sort of a false respect. It was respect that he saw the Lord in Joseph. He saw what Joseph was capable of. But it wasn't a trust, because we would see later that this would turn on Joseph. So he gained a false respect. It was a respect that lasted for a short time, as we see that he was tried through temptation. In Genesis 39 and verse 10 it says, "And it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her." That phrase day by day, because we always think about the conclusion of that circumstance. We always think about the end. But the fact was, this happened every single day. This was a trial, something he faced every single day. It didn't let up. And he stayed true. Like we see, everything changed for Joseph, but what was on the inside didn't. He was tried through temptation, and he persevered day by day. He was falsely accused. In verse 14 it says, "That she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in Hebrew unto us to mock us, and he came in to me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice." And it goes on. He's falsely accused. He was tried, he persevered, but it still ended up with a negative result. His heart was in the right place, what he was doing was right, but there were still negative consequences. This is often what brokenness looks like. No matter what your state of heart is, no matter your perspective on your own life, how you're doing, how close you are to God, how much you stay in His Word, how much you pray, when the negative consequences come, it's confusing. It's odd that life would take a turn like it did in Joseph's life, despite his perseverance day by day. He was put in a cell, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. Joseph goes through a setting change, a new place, gaining a respect that he would lose, trying through temptation day by day, being falsely accused, there being negative consequences to the perseverance that he had showed, and it ending up with him in a cell. I had originally written this point in another message about a year ago, and that was to parallel each of these things to the life of Christ. That was going to be the point of the message. It didn't end up being that, and I ended up taking it and using it for this. But if you look at each one of these things, each thing that Joseph goes through, you can see a very clear pattern, like God was painting a picture in the Old Testament that pointed to Christ. Christ's brokenness was shown in Joseph's life. What would happen to Christ is there's a blurry picture in Joseph's life, a pattern that was set, like there was a visual being placed into the Old Testament. Like Joseph's character arc was a display of what would happen to Christ. Christ was put in a new place. Christ was in heaven. No greater setting change than that. Heaven taken to earth, a new place. He gained a false respect, didn't he? People followed him. I think of John chapter number 6. When he multiplies the food, he feeds all the people, they follow him. And they're following him. A lot of people are. They become his disciples. And when they hear the truth, what he says, they leave him. The respect goes away because that's not why they were there. They were there because they could get something, kind of like Potiphar respected him because he provided a service to him. He gained a false respect. He was tried through temptation. I think about Jesus in the wilderness. He was tempted. Satan attacked him while he was tempted. And of course, he was falsely accused. Christ was perfect. Christ had no sin. And yet Christ was accused. I think about how Joseph was placed in a cell. Christ was slain, and he was buried. He was bound, but 3 days later he rose again. Joseph wouldn't stay in the cell either. There's a pattern. The life of Christ pictures, or the life of Joseph pictures what would happen to Christ. So, in being broken to Christ, and getting near to Christ, he was not only being drawn near to Christ, but he was becoming like him. It wasn't a positional change as much as it was an actual being change, a condition of the heart. Of course, Christ's life is to be our pattern. It's to be what we're striving for. And what we see is Joseph's life and even his actions, which we're going to talk about in a second, are that of Christ's. He's being molded into the image of Christ. He's being broken to the image of Christ. The becoming of Joseph's life, there's probably a phrase that you have heard about Joseph. If you've done any study on Joseph, or I'm thinking of books on Joseph, anything you've ever read on Joseph, you know about a certain phrase, and that's that the Lord was with him. It's mentioned 4 different times. I was trying to find the pattern between those 4 different times, and it wasn't what I thought it would be. It's mentioned 4 different times in 2 different places, on 2 different situations that he is in. One is when he's with Potiphar, and the other one is when he's in the prison. It's mentioned twice in both of these places. The first thing we see when it's talking about the Lord being with Joseph, we see that all the fruit that came from Joseph's life was prosperous. It says that several times. In chapter 39, in verse 2, it says, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian." What he did was prosperous. If we look over to verse number 21, it says, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." Down beneath it says, At the end of verse number 23, it says, "And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper." The Lord was with Joseph. Through all of this brokenness, the Lord was with him. And every time it talks about the Lord being with Joseph through all of this, I want to say this correctly, it's not talking about lifting up his emotions or in a negative sense, like he's becoming, or like he's carrying him through, which he is, but it's all positive. Everywhere where it talks about the Lord being with Joseph, it's talking about things prospering, what people are seeing in Joseph's life. It's almost like it's not talking about the brokenness. It's not talking about the bad things that are happening to Joseph, even though there are. When the Lord is with Joseph, the conclusion is it prospers. Everything Joseph does, it prospers. And what we see out of that is that others saw it. Others saw it. We see it prospering, but we also see, if we're going to look in verse 3 of chapter 39, it says, "And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand." People saw it. Other people see your brokenness. When the Lord is with you, when stuff is prospering for you, when your fruit turns out to be good in your bad times and your low points, other people are watching and other people can see it. Later we see the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made to prosper. Earlier it says, "And the Lord gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." We see what he did. The fruit came from it, and we see that other people saw the fruit. Don't you think that made an impact on their life? Egypt is very often a picture of the world. Potiphar's life was probably not a clean one, not a pure one. But he saw Joseph. Who knew the slave that he would buy at the market that day would be a picture of Christ in his life? And Joseph wasn't living on the high parts of the mountains. He was living in the valleys. Joseph was at the low point. Joseph didn't know that. Potiphar didn't know that. The keeper of the prison didn't know that. Nobody can see the bigger picture. Only God can. Joseph became a picture, a visual. They saw something different in Joseph. I can't imagine what it's like. That could have never happened, to where a keeper of a prison would see a prisoner and put him in charge of everything. That could never. I can't imagine that happening in any other circumstance. That just doesn't make sense. But God used Joseph. Other people saw Joseph's brokenness. How does this apply to us? In a world that's pushing us away from Christ, that's telling us to look at the bad things that are happening and to make a decision against truth, how does Joseph's life show us that it is possible to be broken to Christ, that it's possible to get closer to Christ? Joseph's life, Joseph's brokenness, not only took him closer to Christ positionally, but to the image of Christ. That's our goal. It's talking constantly about how our flesh is supposed to be made a sacrifice, and how it's supposed to be placed on the altar, and how our flesh is constantly supposed to be being broken. And that is all to push us to the image of Christ. It's all to push us to being like Christ, to abide with him. But something that kind of dawned on me that I never thought of in this way before, in this perspective. We see Joseph's life happen over a handful of chapters in Scripture. But this happened over a very large period of time. Joseph's dream came at the early part of his life. But it didn't come true till much, much later. And we see it happen close together, but Joseph didn't. Joseph saw it happen over his entire life. I wonder how often Joseph thought about the dream. How often Joseph was sitting in the cell and thinking about the promise that God had made to him. I wonder if he ever thought whether it was really a promise or if it was just another dream. whether he ever doubted it. I wonder how often it came to his mind. God doesn't speak to us through dreams anymore. He's given us his word. But we don't see Joseph doubting the dream. Now, he may have. But we don't see Joseph doubting the dream. We don't see him doubting the promise. If at any point in time, between these chapters of his life, if he would have had a logical analyzation of his life, he would have thought, there's no way this dream could ever come true. There's no way the promise will be fulfilled. It's impossible. That would have made sense. But he remembered the dream, and he didn't doubt it. God has given us his word. And it is so easy to doubt it, and his promises, and to go farther and farther away from it. But the key to being broken to Christ and to staying on the path to the image of Christ is staying in his word and remembering it. Through each point of our lives, the bad times, where things are rough, we have to remember what he says in his word. We have to abide with him. The Lord was with Joseph, but the Lord is with us in maybe even more of a way. If you're saved, God lives inside of you. The Lord is with you. The Lord is with me. Why can't what we do prosper? We must remember what he gives us in his word, the truth. There's no greater thing to remember than the cross. No matter how bad your point is, no matter how bad it is, there was no darker point than the cross. There was no more hopeless point for the viewer than the time of the cross. But there was no greater promise than the resurrection. Joseph was given a dream. Joseph was given a promise. Just like there was a promise that Christ would rise again, that he would not stay dead, that he would not stay in the grave. Morning would come. We are given a promise today. If you're saved, heaven awaits you because of what happened on the cross. Morning will come. No matter how dark it is, the Lord is with you. He has given you his word. He has given us his word. And he has made a promise to us that we will be with him in heaven forever. It is impossible when you're broken to get closer to Christ if you're not saved. This is possibly why the world has come to the place it is. Why most stories that are being written today are written in this manner. Why there's an excuse for evil. Because there is no light. They don't have a dream. They don't have a promise. If you're not saved today, then you have nothing to hope for. There is no promise. There is no dream. You can't go to heaven because sin can't get into heaven. But it's a free gift. You can be a part of it. The Lord can be with you. You can take a part of what God has given us in his word. You can have a promise. You can have a dream like Joseph did. There is hope in your life if you're saved. A hope that the world doesn't have. Hopefully this would push us to telling the world about it. There's no greater motive for the Great Commission than the cross. The joy of our salvation there's no greater motive than that. Sin pushes us away from that. Sin breaks us from that. We lose the joy that comes with salvation when we sin, when there is a divide between us and God. But the world has the opportunity to be saved. And if you're not saved in this room tonight, you do too. So there's two things. To the unsaved person in the room, today is the day to make that decision. Today is the day to be saved. You're not promised tomorrow. That's what James taught the children this morning. Such a simple concept that time is finite. We aren't promised any length of it. We aren't promised a certain amount of it. If you're not saved tonight, today's the day. If you are saved, remember that you have a hope. Don't forget it. Remember to stay in His Word through the dark times, through the broken times. Don't allow yourself to have an excuse. Don't make room for evil. You don't have to. That's debilitating more than you think it is when you enter into it. You don't have to make room for evil because of the hope that we're given in His Word. Stick to hope and tell other people about it. There's power in the Great Commission. There's power in the cross, the perspective it gives us.